Welcome back to the second course stream of this week. Where had we left off? Well, we had just talked about places like the Jiangnan Arsenal, where Western learning was increasingly adopted to help to save and reform dynastic China, the Qing Dynasty, and that this had led in some circles to a sort of dialectic between hatred and admiration of the West, and also a fear that too many reforms, too much learning from the West might ultimately actually threaten the existence of the dynasty or the very institutions those reforms were meant to save. Now, we're going to talk a lot about America today. This is actually really the topic of this class, China and America. And finally, in this class on Sino-Western relationships, we're at a point where America comes into the picture, where America, in a way, increasingly stands for the West. But what we must not forget, and this is really important, and unfortunately something for which we don't have much time in this class, because it's not the topic of this class, is that for much of the late 19th century, and certainly the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, is that Japan was in a way a much more important influence on China because of its proximity, both in terms of geography but also in terms of language and culture. And Japan also had embarked on a rapid westernization, started to learn from the West, started to modernize, started to adopt a lot of Western institution, Western learning, Western technology. And China actually increasingly turned towards Meiji Japan to borrow some of that learning. So you might have heard about the Meiji Restoration in Japan in the middle of the 19th century, 1868, that ushers in a new era in Japan. A constitutional monarchy is established, legal reforms very much based on European law, on Napoleonic codes, modernization of its military very much modeled on Germany or Prussia at the time. And as a result, Japan experiences rapid economic growth. It witnesses an unprecedented population growth. And as a result of all of that, Japan increasingly turns into an imperialist nation of its own. It embarks on imperialist expansion, first on the Korean peninsula, and later this leads to conflict with China. It culminates in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, which in itself culminates in a naval battle where these two Asian nations clash. And the Japanese, like the Chinese, had modernized their fleet. You remember that I mentioned the Beiyang fleet before, the Chinese fleet, which in the 1860s, 1870s was the biggest and most modern fleet in Asia. Many of the ships actually had been built in Germany, which at the time was really an up-and-coming nation in Europe with a huge industrial and military and industry. Now, during the decisive battle at the Yalu River, China's Beiyang fleet is decimated by Japan's much smaller fleet and is actually eventually defeated. Here's a replica of the flagship of the Chinese fleet, the Dingyuan, which was built in Germany. It's a museum now. Now, as a result of this war, Taiwan is ceded to Japan, and Japan also really embarks on its colonization of Korea. But also as a result of this, Japan becomes a destination for a first wave of Chinese students studying abroad, like Lu Xun, some of you might have heard of, Chiang Kai-shek, and many others. But most of them actually went there to study really Western learning, Western technology. Here you have that image once more of that battle. This is a Japanese woodblock print. Now, but I had said that this week we really want to talk about China and America. And what we want to do is we want to focus on the writings of 3 very different yet very, very interesting Chinese at that pivotal moment in China's history, at that pivotal moment of Sino-Western relations at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. So we start with Xu Jiyu, a high-ranking government official of the late Qing. You see, he was actually still born in the 18th century, died 1873. Now, during the First Opium War, he was stationed in Fujian province, and he witnessed the war firsthand, and he became convinced that China needed to learn more about the West to better understand this new threat. He was later appointed governor of Fujian in 1846 after the First Opium War, where he frequently met with foreign residents, merchants, probably missionaries, who provided him with information on the outside world, the world beyond China's borders. He then, in 1849, penned down a very important work called A Short Account of the Maritime Circuit, 银环志略, which included maps of the world and other territories, and which really challenged the Sinocentric worldview. Now, this work was actually hugely popular in Japan, much more influential in a way in Japan than it was in China. Since 1861, Xu Jiyu then works in the newly established Foreign Office, the Zhongli Yamen. We already mentioned that in the first course stream, and he was later put in charge of the Tongwenguan, a newly established academy for foreign language study in Beijing. So you really see that there are circles in China who realize the importance of better understanding the outside world to better face those challenges. Now, Xu Jiyu never actually visited America, but by meeting with American missionaries, he obtained knowledge about America, and he wrote that down as part of that short account of the maritime circuit, and we're going to read an excerpt from that. And the kind of questions I want you to bear in mind as you approach the text are these. What is particularly noteworthy about America to Xu? In what terms does he describe George Washington? Does his account have anything in common with the accounts of the Jesuits of China? Somebody else who is really important in the early days of the Sino-Western / Sino-American relationships is this fellow here, Yongwing, or Ronghong, 1828 to 1912. He is not part of the assigned readings, but I put a link under additional resources. So if you're interested, please take a close look. Or if you want to do your final project on Yongwing, feel free to do so too. So Yongwing was the first Chinese student to receive a BA from a U.S. college, from Yale College, no less, in 1854. And after he returns, Yongwing becomes an advocate for that self-strengthening movement, an advocate for reform in Qing Dynasty China. He is entrusted by Zheng Guofan, another really important Qing Dynasty official. Don't have time to talk about him, but there's always Wikipedia if you're curious. With the purveyance of modern machinery during the self-strengthening movement we talked about. Another reason why Yongwing is so important for the Sino-American relations is because he was really the mastermind of the Chinese educational mission of 1872 to 1881, which was an attempt by reform-minded officials of the Qing Dynasty to educate a group of 120 Chinese students in the United States, to send them to the United States and to study Western science and technology. And unfortunately, that mission was eventually aborted. I'll say more about that in a second. He was also an early activist who advocated for the rights of Chinese abroad, right? In the late 19th century, we see a lot of Chinese leave the country. We already mentioned that in the wake, especially of these terrible civil wars, we would think of them as economic migrants. Some of them go to Hong Kong, some to other places in South Asia, but a lot of them come to America, the United States, or the southern part of the Americas. So he traveled to Peru, where he investigated the living conditions of Chinese laborers working there. And then in 1909, he published his memoir, and it's his memoir. I put links here on the PowerPoint that is available free of charge for any one of you to read. But let's read just one little passage here. My life in China and America. I was born in 1828 in the village of Namping, which is about 4 miles southwest of the Portuguese colony of Macau. So you see that, right, Macau, Hong Kong, these places really had an impact of people living in their vicinities. As early as 1834, an English lady, Miss Goodsluff, wife of the Reverend Charles Goodsluff, a missionary to China, came to Macau and, under the auspices of the Ladies' Association in London for the promotion of female education in India and the East, immediately took up the work in the school. Is cut off. Now, Karl Friedrich August Goodsluff was actually a Protestant missionary from Germany, not from England. His wife might have been from England, who helped translate the Bible into Chinese and who was very, very active as a Protestant missionary, right? And he founded a mission school with his wife. And you can see that these mission schools then actually did have an impact on more and more Chinese people. You see, the Jesuits really were only able to reach a very small part of the population, right? Because they had these very limited contacts with essentially the very top government elites. But it was after the Opium Wars, when missionary activity had to be permitted, because that was, essentially a clause of the Treaty of Nanjing, that missionaries target more and more the general population, especially, I think we discussed that, in hard-hit parts of the country, where sometimes people just out of desperation would flock to Christendom. Now, I mentioned that Chinese education mission, which unfortunately came to an early end because of a number of scandals and quarrels. And Huang Zunxian, right, whom we've already encountered, we already read his poem about Hong Kong. He also read a poem about the Chinese education mission and its early termination. Let's quickly have a look at that, just the English here. The Han once had extensive relations with the Western regions. At the height of our prosperity, pupils from around the world were dispatched to us to study under imperial teachers. He says the Han here, the Han Dynasty, which was of course Chinese dynasty around about the time of the Roman Empire. We talked about that way back at the beginning of our class. But this is sort of a poetic convention. Whenever poets wanted to talk about the greatness of China, they would talk about the Han, and here it's sort of a metaphor then for the Qing at its height, right, the Qing Dynasty. Unfortunately, in the Imperial Academy, the curriculum has not included Western learning. Withal, on the promotion of science now depends the future of the nation. A decade's effort in training youths will lay the foundation for a country's wealth and strength. So again, Huang Zunxian clearly embraces the idea of learning from the West, sending these students abroad. But then he says, such a far-reaching policy has been ruined by the private quarrels, but the offense does not seem to merit the punishment, and it is too late for the reparative measures. With one misstep, the wasted years, there will not be another chance. Watching the liner return homeward, the thousand thoughts fill my heart with sadness. So again, we can't go too much into detail, but this, of course, would make a terrific topic for your final project. If you want to learn more, you could do a little bit of research on that. And here are two statues of Yongwing, one at Yale, where he is still celebrated to this day as the first Chinese to receive a BA, and here a statue in Hartford, Connecticut. Now, meanwhile, and this is again something we discussed before, in a way far more consequential than the cessation of Hong Kong was the opening of treaty ports along the coast. And the Chinese city where the Western influence was most keenly felt was Shanghai, where following the Opium Wars, a foreign concessions area was set up. Essentially, a city within the city where foreigners resided and where they had extraterritorial rights. And as a result, the city soon develops into China's most important industrial, commercial, and very important printing hub. Here you have a map a little later, 1908. This is the old Chinese city, and then here, this is the foreign concession, and the city itself just grows and grows and grows into China's biggest city very soon. But I said that what is interesting for our class is that it sort of turns into a printing hub. Western modern printing technology is imported to China, and along with that, cheap industrially produced paper. And together with Western investment, people who see an opportunity in setting up these sort of printing presses and newspapers, we see a print revolution in late 19th century China, with lots of journals being printed. And one of them, the Dianshijai Pictorial, illustrated news of the Dianshijai lithographic studio, became one of the most popular magazines, in part because it had so many nice illustrations. Here on the right you see an image from the journal of the workshop in which the Dianshijai Pictorial was produced on those modern steam-driven printing presses. This is really an interesting image, and there is a hyperlink if you want to see or read a little bit more about the Dianshijai. So this pictorial was published in Shanghai between 1884 1898, and it was a spin-off of a newspaper, the Shenbao newspaper, which was really China's first modern newspaper, which had been founded by an Englishman, Ernest Major, for whom this was really just an investment opportunity. In a way, a social media startup, so to speak, in the 19th century. Now, the Dianshijai Pictorial became a really important source of information about the West, Western modernity, for a general public. And the fact that it was so popular and widely consumed really shows us that there was a lot of curiosity in late Qing China about Western modernity. And I want to just show you a few images. This is one of my favorites. So you have these Chinese ladies, in their Chinese mansion, using binoculars, looking at the foreign concession areas. You see the towers of this church towering over the Chinese city, right? So a lot of curiosity. What's going on there? What's this Western city? What are those tall buildings? Here we have an image of the Bund, which was the main street in the foreign concession along the river. In the river, of course, you can see those steam-driven pedal steamers, right? You see horse-drawn carts. You see gas street lamps here, which of course had been referred to also by Huang Zunxian in the poem. I don't know if you caught that reference, right? He calls them fire trees with silver petals. And here we have the inside of St. Ignatius, a Jesuit church in Shanghai, which when it was completed in 1910 was the largest Catholic cathedral in Asia. Still there to this day. If you ever make it to Shanghai, you should visit. Here's a billiard hall for Chinese customers playing billiard. So I'll leave it at that, and I just want to say a couple of words about the two other individuals whose works we're reading for this class. The first of these is Zhang Deyi, who was among the first 10 students of the Tongwen Guan. You remember, right, that school that had been set up in Beijing to teach foreign languages. And he excels at the study of English, and as a result, in 1866 is sent to Europe and on an exploratory mission led by Robert Hart, who was the British superintendent of the Imperial Maritime Customs Office, or the IMC, which had been set up after the Opium Wars to collect maritime trade taxes. And those taxes went into the Chinese coffers. So ironically, right, this institution that was set up with the help of Westerners after these terrible, terrible Opium Wars became one of the most important sources of revenue for the Qing government. And in a way, a really interesting example of Sino-Western cooperation in this difficult period. Again, this would make a great topic for your final projects. He accompanies Robert Hart, but he also visits America in 1868 with the Burlingame Mission, another important mission we don't have much time to talk about, but again, if you're interested, right, all of these could be great projects for your final projects. And this mission was meant to establish formal friendly relations between the United States and China. He later also visited Germany and served in London as China's first professional diplomat. And he wrote several volumes of diaries that were all very well received, very influential. And we are reading one excerpt in which he talks about America. And again, I want you to sort of reflect on similar questions as I asked you before, but also maybe what can you say about the style of the diary? We've read diaries, right, before in this class. In what way does his account differ from that of Xu Jiyu? And what does Zhang admire most about America, and why? And the last person from whom we're going to read a short excerpt is Li Gui, 1842, so born really just in the wake of the First Opium War, into a wealthy family near Nanjing. He is actually captured during the Taiping Rebellion. Remember that terrible civil war I mentioned earlier. Witnesses the unspeakable violence that occurs. He then becomes a secretary to another individual who came to play a big role in Sino-Western relations, Frederick Townsend Ward, who led the ever-victorious army that was helping the Qing Dynasty suppress that rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion. He learned English while he was working for Townsend Ward, and he eventually finds employment with the IMC, right, the Imperial Maritime Customs, and then he's chosen by the IMC to lead a Chinese delegation to the American Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, what we now call the Expo. And in 1877 he publishes a new account of a trip around the globe, 环游地球信录, in which he chronicles his travels to America and Europe, which was widely read among reform-minded intellectuals, and of course which we are reading this week. So what did Li Gui most admire about America, and why, and how does he write about the places he visits? Oh, and here we have, of course, an etching of the Expo in Philadelphia, 1876. So, our forum assignment: based on your reading of the three accounts of America by Xu Jiyu, Zhang Deyi, and Li Gui, and if you like also Yongwing, please write a short response in which you address some of the following questions. What did the three men or four find particularly noteworthy about America? In what terms do they describe George Washington and other Americans? What do they think about American institutions, American democracy, and the American government? How do these accounts differ from each other? How do these accounts compare to those of the Jesuits about China? And in what way do these three accounts broaden our understanding of Sino-Western relations in the 19th century? Please provide textual evidence and citations from all three texts, or four, if you want to include Yongwing. I look forward to reading your posts, and I will see you again next week.